What's new?
I'm Zeb Elif, Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College and Hebrew Theological College. And today I'm joined by Lance Sussman, Senior Rabbi of Reform Congregation Knesset Israel and Chairman of the Board of Gratz College, both in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, nearby Philadelphia. And perhaps his greatest credential, other than being just an outstanding colleague, senior colleague and friend, is his book authored about 25 years ago on Isaac Leeser and the making of American Judaism. And even since then, whenever Dr. Sussman publishes something, he tends to change the field and make us think differently about how we read and write American Jewish history. Thanks so much for joining.
My pleasure. Thank you for asking. So looking over the literature of the last 10 years, what struck me as new was an emphasis on economic history during this period, which is important historiographically speaking for the general study of American Jewish history, that it broadens its methodologies and work its way into the mainstream of historiography. And I saw that in particular with respect to economic history during this period. In fact, recently, last year in 2019, the American Jewish History Journal devoted an entire entire number to economic history. And then within the field itself, we have both Adam Mendelsohn and Hasia Diner looking at peddlers. There's a book on Cotton and Capitalism by Michael Cohn. Shari Rabin writes on Jews in the Frontier with an emphasis on mobility. And at Brandeis, Daniel Judson did a dissertation and book on the finances of the synagogue that he called Pennies from Heaven. And I can tell you, as a congregational rabbi, that title is scary because we need much more than pennies from heaven to make the synagogues work. So I think what's really new here is an economic emphasis that we've had others in the past, but not a clustering like this. And that general field of economic history, of course, is very, very vigorous. The second really new thing that has emerged, although there aren't as many titles, is a transnational perspective. I think is very, very important. We certainly don't want to be accused of being provincial about our study of the short 19th century. And we have a number of works that are transnational. Again, Adam Mendelsohn and Ava Kahn put out a piece on transnational traditions. And in one call for new literature, a new young German scholar, Markus Krah, also called for more transnational studies. And I think based on some of the conferences that I've been on, we may see more of that, which is important because it brings the study of American Jewry in the 19th century out of its silo, which is very, very important, particularly with respect to American historiography. So that's what I see as what's coming up new. Within the field itself, if one were to just go for quantity, because we don't want to doubt quality, the last 10 years, of course, included the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War. And marking that occasion, as has happened in the past, 1654, 1954, et cetera, precipitated a great deal of literature, and probably the largest clustering I saw of titles of major studies as well as articles was in around the Civil War, but not just the Civil War. In other words, the scholarship now, it seems to me, often includes Civil War and Reconstruction, and that period between the end of the war and the rise of East European immigration to the United States, at least when I was in graduate school back in the 1980s, was still kind of a dark period in the study of the American Jewish experience. But now we're getting a lot of titles, both books and articles in Reconstruction. So this period has become deeper in my period. We have the pre-war period, the Civil War itself, and Reconstruction. And luckily, new scholars have paid a great deal of attention to.
The first scholar who really blew this open was Bert Korn. who is both your predecessor on the rabbinic side and to a certain extent on the scholarly side as well. Why is it that the Civil War and the antebellum and the postbellum period, why is it so integral? In probably ways different than even World War I or even World War II. World War II for obviously the Shoah in a different perspective. But what is it about the Civil War that has engendered this scholarly attention, both in terms of Korn, who wrote, I think, his book in the 1950s, but also more recently? Is it just the 150th anniversary, or was there something about the American Jewish experience that is linked inextricably to the Civil War?
Well, the war itself was a great and terrible watershed in all of American history. I don't know who said it, but there was a claim once that war was time accelerated, and the war advances a lot of changes in the American Jewish community. And just as the war was a major event with respect to race and slavery and regionalism in the United States, it also had a tremendous impact on the American Jewish community, the speeding up of the Americanization of the large German Jewish immigration population, the formulation of national organizations was strengthened and accelerated. And then after the war itself, you have this national thirst for unity. The name union itself pops up in so many Jewish organizations as a statement that it really does change the character of the American Jewish experience. And the trauma of the war, as some have suggested, may have impacted American spirituality. There are very good studies beyond the American Jewish community of, for instance, funeral practices as a result of the war. And in many ways, they're still with us. And today, which is it's recent but it's consistent, the whole issue of race has become a headline in American life, and therefore in Jewish life. I just did a piece on the early founding of Reform, from when it first shows up in Charleston in the mid-1820s to the beginning of the Civil War, and I read it through the perspective of race. You go back through the literature, it's mentioned, but it's not a category of analysis. So, for example, the famous speech by Gustavus Poznański in Charleston, when he says, this synagogue is my temple and Charleston is my Jerusalem. Some people argued, and there was a book by Weissman during this period, that kind of represented the crystallization of the Americanization of Judaism. And I went back and looked at it and said, well, Poznański was a Confederate supporter, and his son actually dies in the Confederate army. The father probably owned a slave. So many early American Jews owned slaves, and in fact, the early Reform movement, including Isaac Mayer Wise, did very little to condemn slavery, and many were slaveholders. Einhorn comes in and emerges as an abolitionist, and in so doing establishes the tradition of social justice, but it takes a very long time. So when you revisit this period and you add the dimension of race, with the Civil War is the ultimate test of that, all of a sudden it begins to look very different, and what is familiar all of a sudden no longer looks so familiar. It has to be reread, and it's uncomfortable. As to be expected, there's an emphasis, again by quantity, on issues pertaining to Judaism as religion in this field. Many articles, really equal to the number on Civil War. And in my opinion, what to watch in this literature on religion, including some of your own works, is how is our teacher and friend's thesis, Jonathan Sarna's thesis, about an American Jewish awakening right at the end of this period. Because if Sarna is right, then what leads up to the awakening becomes even more important. His thesis here about an awakening toward the end of the 19th century, before East European arrival, may just be right, and it's novel, and it changes the way we periodize, it changes the way we think about the German Jewish experience. And so the study of religion in particular, after the War of 1812 and ending at the end of, let's say, stretch a little to the 19th century, becomes very, very important. Your own work on rabbis and synagogues, I think, builds well on that thesis. We have a number of topical studies that cover the spectrum of Judaism in America in terms of chronology, but cut across this period. And we have new information. Diane Ashton writing on how Hanukkah develops over time in America. And we have Lincoln Mullen from outside of the field, so to speak, writing on the history of conversion, which is very, very important. Especially looking backwards from our own time with high rates of mixed marriage, super high rates of mixed marriage, and also at various points very high rates of conversion. So that kind of has opened up, and I'm very fond of the work. Who I don't know him, but I'm fond of his work. Judah Cohen in Indiana has written on 19th century religious music in the synagogue, which I think is.
He taught me at least a new word, the cantorate. If there's a rab in it, there must be a cantorate. Yeah.
And I think that's critically important. You know, we tend to look at rabbis, but there are other categories, including music. I like the expression when a person sings his or her prayers, they sing twice. So if you want to cut to the core of the spirituality, music is so important. There's also art. Jenna Weissman Jocelyn wrote on the Ten Commandments, and again, that breaks through in our period, and it's a significant indicator of the Americanization of Judaism.
And I'm convinced that you can't read my book without reading Judah's as well, that they're so important. And maybe what you're suggesting is true, is that, I'm thinking some of the earlier histories on mid-19th century American Judaism focused on the Americanization of it. That was a book, The Americanization of American Judaism. And now we have, we've added texture to it. In some ways it's thematic. It's adding music and the cantors alongside the rabbis. It's art and culture. And you've done work, I think your master's thesis many years ago, which ought to be published at some point. There's a PDF floating around about it, but the idea of culture being infused into American Jewish life in this period. But the synagogue still does loom the largest.
Yes, the synagogue. There were only a few synagogue studies. Over time, synagogue studies have shifted partly from projects within the synagogues themselves, which are laudatory, to more critical pieces. And the more of that we'll have, the better, because they can dig deeper into the local archives to get the empirical part of the history. The interpretive part is something else again, and that's where the work of people like Dr. Sarn is so important.
Right.
Yeah, there was, I should mention, this massive set that came out on the history of the Jewish community of New York City, that urban biographies, communal biographies have always been important in this field from the very beginning at the end of the 19th century. And this collection, City of Promises, takes it to a whole different level. Also would like to mention the beginning of a wonderful little book called The Jews of Key West, Florida, by a poet down there. I was involved as a consultant in this particular project. And the most interesting part of the story for me about Key West was the beginning, that Key West was south of the Confederacy. And it never really was part of the Confederacy. It was a Union outpost, and how it became important because of the shipping lanes. And this was a place to stop and jump off. So it had it's a southernmost outpost looking north. And it's a very fine study, and very elegantly published.
Right. And what it also betokens is all the different areas that you've highlighted, is the revived scholarly spirit of economic history, of insiders and outsider histories in regard to the Civil War, and not necessarily transnationalism or transatlantic, but thinking about porous borders and how different communities speak to one another.
I think I must include continued developments in the study of women's history in general, in history, certainly in the American Jewish experience. And in this period, most recently, Pam Nadell put out a comprehensive survey, which is just a beautifully prepared work and insightful, mixing the public and private in a very effective way. We also saw a biography of Ernestine Rose, who's an important character who needed illumination. And we now have that study that we didn't have before.
Right, and the work on women in American Judaism is just that. It isn't looking to understand the women's experience in isolation, but the scholars who have done this, thankfully, have made sure to integrate it into the field so that this new scholarship can speak with the extant literature as well.
Yes, I agree, and I think it will prove to be transformative in how the narrative is shaped in the future.
Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.